The courtroom was small, almost cramped, with its beige walls and rows of wooden benches that squeaked under the weight of restless bodies. The faint hum of the overhead lights created a sterile atmosphere, making everything feel mundane. People shuffled papers, their eyes darting nervously between the judge's bench and their own lap, as if waiting for the next order to come down. Maya Clark sat at the defendant's table, her posture straight, hands folded neatly in her lap. She was dressed in a tailored black suit that exuded both professionalism and quiet confidence. Her face, calm and collected, revealed little of the storm of thoughts inside her mind. This was just another day, another business infraction, nothing out of the ordinary, she thought. At least, not for most people. Judge Thomas Pierce, a white man in his late 60s, looked down at the paperwork in front of him. His glasses sat low on his nose as he scanned the document, his expression impassive. He had heard similar cases 1,000 times before, and nothing about this one seemed different. A small fine for a minor business violation, nothing that warranted much attention. He adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "Miss Clark," he began, his voice firm but not unkind, "you stand before this court today for a violation of federal business regulations. Your company has been found in breach of the consumer protection laws concerning false advertising and misleading statements. The evidence is clear, and as such, a fine of $25,000 is to be imposed." Maida's expression didn't change. She knew the infraction was relatively minor, something about a misleading product description that had slipped through the cracks. A simple mistake, one that she had already corrected. She wasn't concerned about the fine itself, but more about the optics of the situation. It wasn't ideal to be standing here, but it was something she could deal with. Judge Pierce, still looking at the paper, continued, "While the offense is minor, I must emphasize that any breach of the law must be taken seriously. The integrity of the business world relies on truthfulness, and violations like this harm not only consumers but the very fabric of our economy." His voice carried a stern edge, as if trying to remind everyone in the room of the severity of the matter. Maya nodded, though her mind was already elsewhere. She had worked hard to get to where she was, building a career from the ground up, and the weight of her reputation mattered to her far more than any fine. But what bothered her was the underlying assumption, the way the court had framed her as a simple business owner, someone easily dismissed by the system. She wasn't just any businesswoman, but no one in this room knew that. The judge's eyes flicked up from the paperwork, locking with hers for a brief moment. "You may pay the fine within the next 30 days, he said, his tone final. "Is there anything you'd like to say before we close this matter?" Maya looked directly at him, her voice steady, though a hint of something deeper simmered beneath the surface. "No, Your Honor. I accept the fine," she said, before standing up and walking out of the courtroom without another word. As the door closed behind her, no one in that room knew they had just witnessed the quiet presence of one of the most influential architects of federal consumer protection laws in the country. Judge Thomas Pierce watched as Maya Clark exited the courtroom with grace, her heels clicking softly against the polished wooden floor. He didn't give her much more thought as he shuffled his papers, preparing to move on to the next case. In his eyes, she was simply another business owner who had made a mistake, an infraction that deserved a fine. Nothing about her demeanor, her calmness, or the way she held herself seemed out of the ordinary. She looked like someone who had perhaps made a minor misstep in the course of running a business, no different from any other defendant who stood before him. Judge Pierce wasn't unfamiliar with the world of business regulations. As a seasoned judge, he had presided over countless cases related to consumer protection, fraud, and violations of business ethics. He was used to seeing corporate lawyers argue their cases, often using complex jargon and legal loopholes to defend their clients. But today's case was different in a way that didn't quite register in his mind. There had been no lawyer representing Maya. She had appeared alone, offering no grand defense, simply acknowledging her mistake. The courtroom had almost felt like an ordinary procedural event. He assumed she was just one of those people who had gotten caught up in the web of technical violations, someone who would take the fine, perhaps without much resistance, and move on with their life. What the judge failed to realize was that this routine courtroom moment was an oversimplified version of a much bigger story. To him, Maya Clark was a nameless face in a sea of business owners he dealt with every day. He didn't consider her backstory, the work she had quietly pioneered in the field of consumer rights, or the magnitude of her influence on federal legislation. He didn't see her for the trailblazer that she was. He only saw the defendant standing before him, whose business had made an error. As the day wore on, Pierce went about his usual tasks. He handed down sentences, listened to testimonies, and adjourned the courtroom, all while keeping his mind firmly planted on the matter at hand. The room slowly emptied, with people filing out into the hallways. Maya's case was already fading from his thoughts. After all, he had seen countless cases like it before. He didn't need to dig deeper. He didn't see the point. The law was clear, and Maya's violation, in his eyes, was straightforward. It was just another day in court. Meanwhile, Maya Clark was on her way out of the courthouse, her mind already working on her next task, as always, focused on her mission to protect consumers from the very forces that often left people like her in positions where they had to fight to be heard. Judge Pierce, still unaware, would soon learn that he had just crossed paths with someone whose quiet contributions had changed the very landscape of consumer protection law. Someone who, in his eyes, was just another defendant. Within days of the courtroom appearance, the story of Maya Clark began to surface, slowly at first, then with an undeniable force. The local news stations were the first to catch on. A report detailing the routine court appearance mentioned Maya's name, and that was enough to start unraveling a story the public had no idea was there. As reporters dug deeper, they uncovered her true identity, and it was like opening the floodgates. Maya Clark was no ordinary businesswoman. She wasn't just someone who had made a minor mistake in the corporate world. Maya was one of the chief architects behind some of the most pivotal federal consumer protection laws in the country. Her work had been instrumental in shaping the regulatory landscape that protected millions of Americans from predatory business practices. She had helped craft the regulations that shielded consumers from misleading advertising, fraudulent lending, and deceptive corporate practices. Her fingerprints were all over laws designed to prevent financial exploitation, laws that many Americans relied on every day. The more the public learned about Maya's career, the more her role became clear. Maya wasn't a faceless corporate player. She was a woman who had spent years fighting for fairness and transparency in the marketplace. Her efforts had made her a silent yet powerful force in Washington, D.C. While the world knew little about her, countless people benefited from the protections she had put in place. She was a name that might not be household, but her influence was undeniable. The media quickly latched onto the irony of the situation. How could the woman responsible for ensuring fairness and protecting consumers be the very same person who had been fined for a simple business error? People were stunned by the contrast between the person they had just seen in the courtroom and the one described in the articles that now flooded news outlets. Maya Clark wasn't just another small-time violator of business law. She was a hero in the world of consumer protection. The story took on a life of its own. Articles began to ask, how could someone with such a profound impact on the legal landscape be treated like any other defendant in a courtroom? Social media exploded with outrage, quickly elevating Maya's case to a national conversation. Supporters rallied behind her, pointing out the irony and raising larger questions about fairness, racial bias, and the way society often overlooks the contributions of women, especially women of color. As the news spread, Maya's quiet world was suddenly thrust into the spotlight. The fine was no longer just a small legal matter. It had become a symbol of something larger, something far more significant than one woman's minor mistake. It was a glaring reflection of how easy it was for someone to be misjudged, even when their contributions had shaped the very systems meant to ensure justice. And Maya, she was watching it all unfold from the sidelines, knowing that this moment, however unexpected, had the potential to spark change far beyond a courtroom. Judge Thomas Pierce sat in his office late into the evening, the weight of the day's events hanging heavily on his shoulders. The courtroom was long empty, but his mind was far from quiet. The television in the corner of his office flickered with the evening news, and there it was again. The story of Maya Clark. The face of the woman he had found just hours earlier now filled the screen. But this time, there was no mention of a business infraction. Instead, the headlines were bold, brimming with significance. Maya Clark, the architect of federal consumer protections. He stared at the screen, his stomach sinking as the pieces of the story slowly clicked into place. The more the reporters spoke, the more it became clear. Maya wasn't just any business owner who had made a minor mistake. She was a powerhouse in the world of consumer protection, an expert who had shaped federal laws designed to protect everyday Americans from financial exploitation. The policies she had crafted had helped countless individuals avoid the clutches of predatory lenders, fraudulent corporations, and other unscrupulous businesses. Judge Pierce's mind raced as he tried to reconcile what he had just learned with his earlier judgment. He had never once considered the possibility that this quiet, composed woman before him was responsible for the very laws that governed fairness and consumer rights. To him, she had simply been another case to deal with, another defendant to judge, another fine to hand down. He felt a strange mix of guilt and disbelief. How had he been so blind? In the hours that followed, the story of Maya's work continued to dominate the airwaves. Reports detailed her pivotal role in the drafting and implementation of laws that protected millions of people from financial ruin. She had worked tirelessly behind the scenes, often with little recognition, and yet here she was, suddenly thrust into the spotlight for a reason no one could have anticipated. The more Judge Pierce thought about it, the more his actions seemed incomprehensible. His thoughts turned inward, questioning his own assumptions. Had he been too quick to judge Maya based on the surface of things? Had he allowed the courtroom to shape his perception of her without taking the time to truly understand who she was or what she had accomplished? He was a man of the law, but today he felt like he had failed to live up to the very principles of justice that he had sworn to uphold. The shock continued to linger. Maya Clark, the woman he had found, was more than just a defendant in his courtroom. She was a champion of fairness, and now, he wondered, how would he ever be able to make amends for his actions? He knew he couldn't undo what had been done, but he also realized that the situation before him was far more than just a legal mistake. It was an opportunity for personal growth, for reckoning, and for change. And it was one that Judge Pierce wasn't going to ignore. By the following morning, the story of Maya Clark's courtroom appearance had exploded across social media. What had initially been a local news report soon became the subject of national conversation. The fine, once perceived as a simple, routine matter, had taken on a far greater significance, and people were asking questions. How could someone who had spent years shaping laws to protect consumers from exploitation be treated as just another defendant in a courtroom? Why had a judge, who prided himself on upholding the law, missed the gravity of her contributions? The outrage was swift and loud. Social media platforms buzzed with people sharing the news, using the hashtag #JusticeForMaya to express their anger. Posts flooded Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, with thousands of users commenting on the irony of the situation. How can you find the woman who protected us from being fined? One tweet read, "She shaped the laws that protect us from fraud, and now she's the one being penalized." Others asked. Maya's story struck a chord, not just because of the court case, but because it tapped into something deeper. The widespread frustration with systemic inequalities and the way those in power often overlook or underestimate the contributions of women, especially Black women. At the heart of the backlash was the issue of racial bias in the justice system. Commentators pointed out how Maya, as a Black woman, had been viewed through the lens of stereotype and assumption. Judge Pierce, they argued, had likely dismissed her without recognizing her for who she truly was, an influential policymaker with a legacy of protecting the very consumers the court was supposed to serve. Some even speculated that the fine was not just about a legal violation, but the result of a systemic failure to acknowledge the contributions of people of color in spaces typically dominated by white leadership. As the story spread, Maya's name became synonymous with fairness and justice. People from all walks of life began rallying behind her. Supporters wrote op-eds, made public statements, and participated in online discussions, amplifying Maya's message about the need for recognition, fairness, and understanding. "This isn't just about one fine," one prominent activist said during a TV interview. "This is about a system that frequently fails to see the value in those who are working to make a difference for all of us." Maya Clark is a hero, and it's time the world knew it. Maya herself, though not one to seek the spotlight, found herself at the center of a movement. In interviews, she spoke with calm authority, never once raising her voice in anger. She acknowledged the irony of the situation, but used it as a platform to address the broader issue: the need for systemic change in both the legal and corporate worlds. She emphasized that her work was always meant to benefit consumers, regardless of their background or income, and that it was crucial to continue fighting for justice at every level, even when those in power failed to recognize it. Her words resonated deeply with the public, and her story quickly became a symbol of resilience. Maya's fine had become something more, a rallying cry for fairness, representation, and recognition in all spaces, legal or otherwise. The growing wave of support made it clear that this was no longer just about one woman's case. It was about transforming the very systems that had allowed her to be overlooked in the first place. As the media frenzy around her intensified, Maya Clark found herself at the center of a storm she hadn't anticipated. But despite the flood of attention, she remained remarkably composed. Maya had never sought the spotlight. Her work had always been done behind the scenes, quietly shaping consumer protection laws that benefited millions of Americans. Yet here she was, thrust into a national debate that wasn't about her work directly, but about the misjudgment and misunderstanding that had occurred in the courtroom. For days, Maya stayed silent, letting the public discourse unfold around her. The anger and support from various quarters grew louder, but Maya knew this wasn't the time for knee-jerk reactions. She wasn't interested in being a symbol or martyr for a cause. What she cared about, what had always mattered to her, was that the issues of bias, fairness, and recognition be addressed. She had spent her entire career working on the laws that protected the most vulnerable, ensuring that fairness, transparency, and truth were accessible to everyone. And now, she realized, she had the opportunity to highlight how these principles were still being overlooked in the most unexpected places. One morning, Maya agreed to sit down with a well-known news anchor for an exclusive interview. The camera crew set up, the crew adjusted their microphones, and soon, the interview began. As the anchor began with the usual questions, Maya remained calm but direct. "I never wanted the attention," Maya began, her voice steady. "But I've come to realize that what happened in that courtroom is about more than just me. It's a moment that shows how quickly people can be judged based on assumptions, based on how they look or who they appear to be. And that's the heart of the issue." The anchor pressed, "Do you feel this was a racial issue? A gender issue?" Maya paused, choosing her words carefully. This wasn't just about race or gender, though those elements certainly complicate things. This is about how easily we dismiss people, how easily the system overlooks those who don't fit a certain mold, who don't come with a list of credentials that make them visible in the eyes of power. I've spent my career making sure that consumers, especially the vulnerable, aren't dismissed. That's why I do what I do. I can't help but wonder how many other people, like me, are overlooked or ignored because they don't fit a certain narrative. Her words resonated beyond the studio, reaching millions. She wasn't looking for sympathy. She was calling for accountability, for a conversation that moved beyond the surface and dug deeper into the structural issues that had allowed this to happen. Maya had a way of making her message clear, without bitterness, without anger. It wasn't about personal vengeance. It was about using her story as a way to fuel the push for broader change. Later that week, Maya released a public statement, reiterating her thoughts in writing. I want to be clear. I'm not angry at Judge Pierce. I'm not even angry at the system. But I do believe in justice, true justice, not just the kind we see in a courtroom. And true justice means acknowledging the contributions of those who may not always be seen, especially when those contributions impact the lives of so many. Her words were measured, thoughtful, and impactful. Maya had managed to turn an uncomfortable moment in her life into a platform for dialogue, a platform that had begun to shift the conversation about fairness in the legal system, consumer protection, and the recognition of individuals who often go unnoticed. The public wasn't just rallying behind her, they were rallying for change. In the wake of Maya Clark's powerful public response, the spotlight turned to Judge Thomas Pierce, who was now under intense scrutiny. The national conversation about his courtroom ruling had taken on a life of its own, with commentators, legal experts, and social justice advocates questioning how he had so easily overlooked Maya's true identity and contributions. Public pressure mounted, and soon, the calls for Judge Pierce to address the situation directly became impossible to ignore. Judge Pierce, who had spent decades presiding over cases with the utmost professionalism, found himself in unfamiliar territory. He had been a part of the legal system for so long that he had never considered that his decisions could be so easily swayed by assumptions or biases. Yet the mounting public outcry made it impossible for him to escape the uncomfortable truth. He had misjudged Maya Clark, and his actions had unintentionally perpetuated a system that often failed to recognize the value of those who worked tirelessly behind the scenes for the greater good. The judge knew that he had to take responsibility for his actions, but he wasn't sure how. He couldn't undo the fine, nor could he erase the impact of his oversight, but he could offer an apology. It wasn't going to be easy. It required a level of humility and accountability he wasn't accustomed to showing. But as he watched Maya's statements continue to circulate and her support grow, Judge Pierce knew that the time had come to acknowledge his mistake and address the public directly. The following week, Judge Pierce made an unexpected public statement. Standing in front of a crowd of reporters, he appeared solemn, his usual stern demeanor replaced by a more vulnerable version of himself. "I want to apologize," he began, his voice steady but filled with the weight of the moment. "I made an error in judgment, and I now realize that I failed to see the full scope of Ms. Maya Clark's contributions. What happened in my courtroom was a reflection of my own shortcomings, and for that, I am deeply sorry." The press cameras clicked, capturing every moment of his apology. Judge Pierce went on to explain how his initial ruling had been based on a surface-level understanding of the case. He admitted that he had not taken the time to understand who Maya Clark truly was, nor had he considered the broader implications of her work. "It's clear to me now," he continued, "that Maya Clark is a visionary in the field of consumer protection. Her efforts have saved countless people from financial harm, and she deserves recognition for that, not punishment." He paused, looking down for a moment before adding, "I have learned from this experience, and I am committed to doing better, to being more aware, more considerate, and more open to understanding the people who come before me. Maya's work should be celebrated, not dismissed, and I will make sure that I never make this mistake again." The apology, though sincere, didn't undo the damage that had been done. But it was an important first step, one that showed the world that even those in positions of power could learn and grow from their mistakes. For Maya, it wasn't about seeking vindication. It was about sending a message that accountability was necessary at all levels of society, from the courtroom to the highest offices in the land. In the days that followed, Judge Pierce reached out to Maya privately to apologize in person. Maya, ever composed, accepted the apology with grace, but made it clear that the real work was just beginning. It was a start, but Maya knew that true change required sustained effort, not just one apology. Still, for the first time in his career, Judge Pierce understood that his role was not just to uphold the law, but to see the humanity of every person who entered his courtroom, no matter their background or status. In the months following Judge Pierce's public apology, The conversation about consumer protection and racial bias in the legal system continued to evolve. What had begun as a single misstep in a courtroom had become the catalyst for an ongoing dialogue about justice, visibility, and accountability in both the legal system and beyond. Maya Clark, while still focused on her work as a champion of consumer rights, found herself at the heart of this new movement. Her role as a quiet architect of significant laws had always been behind the scenes, but the events that had unfolded brought her to the forefront of the fight for fair representation. She didn't seek fame, but she understood that her story had now become a vehicle for change. It was no longer just about a fine. This was about dismantling the assumptions and biases that too often overlooked the contributions of those who didn't fit the mold of power, privilege, or visibility. As the weeks went by, Maya used her newfound platform to advocate for reforms that would ensure people like her, those who worked tirelessly to change the system from within, would no longer be dismissed. She became a voice for others who had been similarly overlooked, from public servants to grassroots activists. In speeches and interviews, she called for a re-examination of how legal professionals and judges interacted with individuals, urging the system to value a person's contributions over their outward appearance or background. "We cannot continue to assume people's worth based on their circumstances," Maya said at a conference on consumer protection. "True fairness lies in understanding the story behind the surface. Only then can we truly enact justice." Maya's case also sparked a broader movement within the legal community. Lawyers, judges, and legal scholars began to take a closer look at how biases influence decisions in courtrooms across the country. Workshops and seminars on racial bias, consumer rights, and the importance of recognizing the work of women and people of color became more common. Legal professionals began to ask themselves how they could be more proactive in recognizing the contributions of those who had been left out of the historical narrative. Judge Pierce, too, underwent a transformation. He dedicated himself to understanding the issues Maya had highlighted in their conversations, seeking to become a better judge and a more thoughtful person. He attended seminars on unconscious bias, diversity, and inclusion, aiming to integrate these lessons into his courtroom. He also publicly acknowledged that he had made significant changes to his approach, not just in cases like Maya's, but in every case he oversaw. "I have learned that justice is not just about applying the law," Judge Pierce said in a follow-up statement. "It is about seeing the full picture and understanding the impact of our decisions on the lives of others." For Maya, the experience had brought both painful lessons and an incredible sense of purpose. She had fought for fairness her entire career, but now her battle had become even more personal. She knew that the work she had started in Washington, D.C., could grow into something larger, a movement for more equitable recognition and respect for everyone's contributions. Maya continued to push forward, never forgetting the lessons learned from the courtroom that day. But what had begun as an unexpected chapter in her life had become a turning point for the system she had worked so hard to improve. The lesson was clear. The fight for justice was not over, and it was far from one woman's story. It was a collective mission, one that would echo for generations to come.